listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Cadigan, Associate Director of Alumni Relations, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Holy Cross Lunchtime Learning webinar event. This is the latest in our continuing series of web-based presentations that feature Holy Cross faculty members discussing their area of expertise and research. We're thrilled to have Ara Francis, Assistant Professor of Sociology, joining us today for a talk entitled Family Trouble, Parenting Kids with Special Challenges in a Child-Centered Era. A very interesting and popular topic, especially based on the response to this webinar. Professor Francis holds a PhD from the University of California, Davis. Her areas of research focus on social psychology, deviance and social disruption, health and illness, gender, parenthood, and family. And we're so happy to have her join us today. We'll be together for a little under an hour, a great opportunity to relive your Holy Cross classroom experience. Professor Francis will speak, and then we'll take questions from you, our listeners, for as long as time allows. I encourage you to submit questions throughout this presentation by checking out the question function located on your webinar toolbar to the right. Again, thank you for joining us, and now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Professor.
Good afternoon. Thanks for signing on, and thank you so much, Tom, for inviting me to do this webinar. I was talking with Tom earlier, and I was saying that it's not actually often that I get to talk about sociology beyond the confines of a conference or a classroom, so it really is a privilege to be able to speak with you today. Let me introduce myself briefly before diving in. This is my 7th year in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at the college, and I'm a microsociologist. What that means is, although my first interest is always in social life and the things that occur between people, I focus for the most part on the smaller components of society. So things like everyday interactions and relationships. I also study phenomena that we sometimes think of as being psychological, so people's minds, hearts, bodies, but I'm interested in their relationship to larger social forces. I regularly teach our department's course in Self and Society and the Sociology of Deviance, as Tom said. I also teach a senior seminar called The Sociology of Trouble. And that class is a sociological exploration of personal upheaval, or what happens to people when something important in life seems to go wrong. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. So in just a minute, I'm going to give you an overview of the webinar, but I actually want to introduce my topic with telling you a story about a family. Tim, Eve, and their son, James. By the time their son was 2, Tim and Eve worried that something might be wrong. James had been slow to meet developmental milestones, and a well-respected psychiatrist told them that some type of major system disorder was delaying the boy's development. One of Eve's family members convinced her that she might be a silent carrier of the genetic condition called Fragile X syndrome, so the couple decided to test James for the condition. They were convinced he didn't have it, but they wanted to make sure, and then the results came back positive. In the months and years that followed, the differences between James and other children became increasingly apparent, and Tim and Eve's lives turned upside down. James had high levels of anxiety, and he was sensitive to sound, so it was really difficult to take him to public places. In Tim's words, his son made weird noises and weird facial expressions that made family members and friends uncomfortable. And by the time James was 8 or 9, Eve said, most of their friends had sloughed off, and she and Tim had few connections beyond their family lives. Tim's career plateaued because he and Eve were unwilling to move James out of his familiar environment. And Eve, for her part, decided to become a stay-at-home mother rather than returning to the workforce like she had previously intended. When I talked to Tim nearly 15 years after his son's diagnosis, he used words like trauma and devastation when describing his experiences. He focused in particular on the feelings of sorrow and anger over the loss of the son he expected to have and the future that he had once taken for granted. So I just want to share with you a few pieces of my recorded conversation with Tim. My wife and I, he said, felt cheated out of what type of relationship we would have had with our son, as he would be growing up and, bringing girlfriends home or playing on the football team or playing the oboe in the school concert. whatever he would have done, what other path or trajectory he would have pursued as a child and as an elementary school kid and as a teenager. We were going to miss out on all of that. You know, we were never going to have the bumper sticker on our car saying my kid is an honors student at George W. Bush Elementary or something. So yeah, there were times I think we were both just angry, and angry at life and angry at the world and angry at our isolation. I just kind of thought that as he grew up, you know, we might have some things in common, like whether it was watching football or going on bike rides or playing softball or going on nature walks, watching him play in the high school basketball game, whatever. All those things you just kind of assume are going to happen in life. And you know what's interesting? You get married, you know it's interesting. You get married and you have a child and you just kind of assume all these things about what it's going to be like. You know, your wife is pregnant and everything seems fine. He's born and he's got, you know, 10 fingers and 10 toes and you think everything is great. And then suddenly you find out it's not. And it's still, it hurts. It's not quite the sharp driving pain it was in the earlier days, but you never really get used to it. So the talk I'm going to give you today is drawn from my recently published book, Family Trouble, Middle-Class Parents, Children's Problems, and the Disruption of Everyday Life. As the title implies, the book is about people like Tim and Eve, the middle-class parents of children who face significant challenges. I conducted in-depth interviews with 55 mothers and fathers, and this group included 34 mothers and 21 fathers, the majority of whom were married and participated with their spouse. Their children's problems were pretty widely variable, ranging from mild to severe. So they included things like ADHD and learning disabilities, developmental disabilities stemming from conditions on the autism spectrum, as well as conditions like cerebral palsy, seizure disorders, mental health problems like depression and bipolar disorders, as well as things like substance abuse or addiction. And the overarching question that really guided my inquiry was, pretty simply, how do children's problems affect parents themselves? What happens to parents when their children struggle? Now, this question was particularly interesting to me in light of what sociologists and historians have called our child-centered era. So in the late modern West, we take for granted that children are among the most important people, and perhaps the most important people in their parents' lives. For people who have children, the various aspects of family life, like how we eat and sleep, how we allot our time, they're organized first and foremost to meet kids' needs. And we totally assume that parenting is a very monumental endeavor that takes a lot of our time, energy, and money. But interestingly enough, you know, history tells us that parenthood has not always been this way. It might surprise you to learn, for example, that all of our best data suggest that today's parents spend more time with their children than people did at the height of the baby boom in the 1960s. And this includes quality time. So when compared with our 1960s counterparts, we spend approximately twice as much time talking, reading, and playing with our children. Now, this is a really interesting trend because during that same period, there was a really significant rise in single-parent families and in married mothers who work outside of the home. We might expect that people would spend a lot less time with their children under those circumstances, but in fact, all of our evidence suggests that it's the opposite. Sociologists explain these data in a few ways. So first, it's worth noting that for increasing segments of the population, having children is a lifestyle choice. Birth rates have been declining now for about a century, and with the widespread availability of birth control, having children is a choice, at least much more so than it was in previous eras. It's also true that the stigma of not having kids is less powerful than it used to be. So remaining child-free, as we now sometimes refer to it, is an increasingly legitimate decision. It might be that we spend more time with our children than we did in the past simply because more of us actually wanted children to begin with. But social historians also point to a related trend that's sometimes referred to as the sacralization of childhood. And this is simply to say that children have come to embody a really highly cherished set of virtues in our modern and late modern society. Prior to the modern era, childhood didn't actually exist, at least not as we know of it. People thought of children mostly as smaller versions of adults, and they were important really only insofar as they could contribute to a household's economy. Now today, of course, any of us that have children know that children are not economic assets, they are economic liabilities. And instead of valuing them for their labor, we value them for what they symbolize. Things like innocence, purity, joy. Perhaps more importantly, we value them because they galvanize within us virtues that seem to be in short supply in our modern era. So things like altruism, unconditional love, and deep personal connection. So the upshot of parenting in this child-centered era is that a lot of us live for our children. Our kids are the emotional centers of our universe. They are in what sociologist Viviana Zelizer calls that our children are priceless to us. So it's in this broader historical context that led me to ask the question, when so much time and energy is dedicated to children's well-being, what happens to parents when their children face significant challenges? Now, what I found was that children's problems had this tendency to disrupt nearly every aspect of parents' lives. And I'll take just a bit of time now to give you an overview of what I mean. First and foremost, children's problems disrupted parents' routines. And they did so by increasing the already high demands of parenthood. The easiest way to put this is that when children have problems, parents spend more time parenting. And this had the tendency to squeeze other aspects of parents' lives to the periphery of their attention. Parents had less time to take care of themselves, less time to spend with other people. They also had less time even for mundane tasks like cleaning the house or doing laundry. Now, this had pragmatic implications like negative effects on parents' health, but it also had what I would call existential implications. So daily routines, sociologists understand, things simply as, as simple as drinking your morning cup of coffee, maybe lunch with a colleague or doing a load of laundry, on a Sunday afternoon. Those things anchor us in social space. They give our lives a predictable quality, and in the absence of those things, life can begin to feel really uncertain or out of sync or even out of control. And that was certainly true among the parents that I interviewed. Relationships were a second aspect of parents' lives that got upended by children's problems. Now, part of this was because the relationships were embedded in the routines that I just spoke about. So mothers and fathers didn't have time to spend with each other or with their friends or with other family members, and it became more difficult to maintain and cultivate those relationships. Parents also argued more often about household tasks because there was less time to get them done. But maybe the most important way that children's problems resulted in the disruption of parents' relationships was stigma. So a lot of men and women, just like Tim and Eve, reported that friends, acquaintances, sometimes even family members, shied away from them because of their children's problems. In a lot of cases, people even blamed parents, either subtly or quite directly for having caused children's problems to begin with. And as you can imagine, that created a lot of tension in existing relationships and also sort of stymied the forging of new relationships. So a third dimension of disruption was parents' expectations of their children. In many respects, unfulfilled expectations were actually at the heart of parents' troubles. Without even realizing it, most of the people I interviewed had developed this really clear picture of who their children would be. And I think we all do this to some extent, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. Before our children are even born, we imagine the adults they're going to grow up to be. We imagine who we will be as their parents, and we envision our family lives unfolding in very particular ways. As parents came to view their children as having significant problems, they really had to re-examine and oftentimes relinquish those expectations. And for some of the people I interviewed, that was an incredibly difficult process. So finally, children's problems disrupted what I call parents' narratives of self. Now, there are a lot of ways of talking about what a self is. Scholars often define it as an internal dialogue or the process of having a conversation with yourself. In everyday speech, we might talk about the self using the language of personality traits or something like that. But one of the common ways that sociologists now think about the self is as a story. So we examine how people weave together the past, the present, and the future into a coherent narrative that explains who they are to themselves and to others. We sort of see the self as an ongoing product of those narratives. And in the context of my research, children's problems really dramatically altered the stories that parents told about themselves. And in many ways, men and women had to rewrite their life story in order to incorporate the disruption that stemmed from children's struggles. Now, these four dimensions of experience were really deeply interrelated. So, for example, parents' narratives of selves were shaped by routines, relationships, and expectations, and vice versa. And what this meant was that children's problems disrupted the different aspects of parents' lives in almost a domino-like fashion. And even comparatively mild problems had this self-amplifying quality that resulted in trouble spilling over into nearly every corner of parents' lives. So what I want to do in the time that remains is to delve more deeply into those dynamics as they pertain to the last two forms of disruption that I outlined, expectations of children and narratives of self. And in the process, I'll touch upon the really deep sorrow associated with children's problems. So just as you saw with Tim's stories, children's problems were often really emotionally devastating for parents, and that emotional turmoil really transformed parents' sense of themselves and the world around them. Now, I just want to mention there's a number of things that I really wanted to talk about but realized I wouldn't have time to address, and I just want to sort of note those here. So the first thing I won't have a chance to talk about is how parents identify their children's problems. Coming to realize that a child has some kind of significant problem is in many cases a really long and difficult and arduous process, and there's a lot to be said about what parents went through in those early days, but that's something I'm not going to focus on here. I also won't get a chance to delve into gender differences or similarities among parents. So there was a lot of moments when mothers and fathers really diverged in their interpretations of what was going on, and there was other moments during which they were a lot more similar than you might expect. I won't get a chance to delve too much into that today. Stigma, I was tempted to do the whole webinar on stigma because it's such a salient aspect of parents' experiences, and you'll hear it in some parents' stories, but it's not going to be the focus of what remains in this presentation. And then last but not least, why only middle-class families? So this study was really intentionally a study of the middle class for reasons I'm not going to go into at the moment, but I wanted to mention these things because I'm more than happy to talk about these topics during the Q&A session if any of them interest you. So now let me move on to talking about expectations. I want to focus closely at what parents thought their children would be like. Now, most parents said they were unaware of their expectations until it became clear that children might not be able to meet them. So in other words, parents' expectations were so deeply taken for granted that they were invisible and therefore unquestionable prior to the development of children's problems. One mother named Kathy, whose 6-year-old son was diagnosed with cerebral palsy around his first birthday, explained to me, I always thought, oh, I never have expectations, because people always say you have these expectations of your children. And I thought, oh, I never did. I don't care if they ever, go to college. But after having my son, then I realized, no, wait, you do think about that stuff, because I realized that he wasn't going to do those things. And that was hard to me. Now, as suggested by Kathy's realization that she did expect her son to go to college, parents expected their children to sort of meet all the benchmarks of what many of us imagine to be a normal middle-class American life trajectory. This included having a lot of friends and earning solid grades, participating in extracurricular activities, earning a college degree, and eventually securing steady employment. For most parents, it included the expectation that children would grow up to have children of their own someday as well. So a quote from Debbie, a mother whose 26-year-old son had been an alcoholic since he was a teenager, I think sums this up really nicely. She said, I pictured having these kids that were very involved in all of their school stuff and were in and out of here with their buddies, doing all the normal things, the football thing, all that stuff, good student, go off to college, get whatever degree in whatever field and live your life accordingly. And that's not what happened. My son was asked to leave the high school in the middle of his senior year because he would show up on campus and just wouldn't go to class. I never pictured that, I'll tell you. I never pictured that one of my kids would not graduate from high school. Now, I have to tell you, I have 2 children of my own, and I identify really readily with Kathy and Debbie's vision of family life. So my son's only 5, but when he comes to campus with me, he often talks about wanting to go to college at Holy Cross. And I sometimes catch myself thinking very fondly about what that might be like. As I said, I think all of us entertain these imagined futures when it comes to our kids. But I would be remiss as a sociologist if I didn't point out the degree to which parents' expectations were class-specific. So higher education especially is a really powerful symbol of middle-class respectability in the U.S. And although a significant proportion of young Americans don't attend college, the parents in this study assumed that their children would earn a bachelor's degree as a matter of course. I interviewed a father named Sam, and his daughter, who's now 17, was diagnosed with ADHD when she was in the 6th grade. She had long struggled with schoolwork, and it was pretty unlikely she was going to attend a 4-year college after graduating from high school. When I asked Sam whether or not he thought that the ADHD would limit her future, here's how he responded. I absolutely want the best for her, and these problems are holding her back. A lot of the dreams that I had for her won't be possible. Education and what comes with that, the ability to be able to excel at something that she really feels good about, to be able to do that in such a way that it can benefit to others, to let her feel real good about who she is and what she's capable of doing, you know, to be able to earn the things I know she likes. As I hope it becomes clear in these comments, the expectation of college was for most parents bound really tightly to visions of middle-class fulfillment and the dream of securing a meaningful vocation and a financially comfortable livelihood. These assumptions about the good life reflected parents' own social locations and their unquestioned belief that their children would grow up to be middle-class adults. Now, having outlined parents' expectations of who their children would be, I want to take some time to talk about the emotional turmoil that followed in the wake of children's problems. Parents' anguish was often just below the surface, and it permeated our discussion of almost all other topics. Nearly every person I interviewed expressed intense sorrow. And like Tim, the father I introduced at the beginning of the talk, many parents use the word devastating to describe the emotional impact of their kids' difficulties. So Debbie, the mother I just mentioned earlier, whose son dropped out of high school, she started to cry as she explained to me. There's real sadness. I mean, just incredible sadness, you know. This is your baby. You brought this little bundle home from the hospital, and it's like the last thing you would ever want is for something like this to happen to them. You know the world is not going to be perfect, but you know, you sure as hell don't envision that when you walk out the hospital door. And there she's referring to her son's alcoholism. It's devastating. It's absolutely devastating. Now, parents' sadness, it was about far more, of course, than just relinquishing what they expected their children to be like. The deep connection that parents felt to their kids meant that they experienced their children's suffering in addition to their own. So there was a mother named Jessica whose 6-year-old son had a lot of trouble controlling his emotions, and he was aggressive with other children. Then those problems had manifested when he was about 4 years old. She told me, it's such a hard emotion to describe, that connection, that feeling of what you feel for your children. It is overwhelming. I don't know if I can describe it. I mean, you'd do anything. You would do anything just for them to make it in this world. And then you see them struggling. It is the saddest thing. It breaks your heart. Now, I know I've offered a couple quotes from mothers describing their grief, and it might be tempting to see this as a gender-specific response. And it's certainly true that some aspects of parents' experiences were highly gendered, but the degree of sorrow related to children's problems was not one of them. So I talked to one father named Seth. His 14-year-old daughter had been addicted to drugs and had run away multiple times. When I interviewed him, his daughter was actually 19 years old, and she was sober, living at home. But Seth was recalling how bad things had been in really vivid detail. So when he and his wife had made the decision to send her to an out-of-state therapeutic boarding school, Seth had to physically force his daughter into the car and drive her against her will to the school site. He told me it was the hardest day of his life. I would rather have lost a limb, you know? I don't know why. When your children are born, they weasel their way so deeply into your heart they are a part of you. Physically, they are just so much who you are, and you care. You do so many things. You make so many accommodations in your life to take care of that. If you're a parent who really cares about your kid, and most people are, it's not a question. Nothing else matters. I mean, literally, burn my house down, everything in it. I don't care. Give me my kids. And most parents, I think, feel that way about their kids. So I take Seth at his word when he said he would have rather lost a limb. Many of the parents I spoke to talked about their children as parts of themselves, and their sorrow was really quite visceral. There are a number of important ways that children's problems changed biographical narratives, or what I referred to earlier as narratives of self. So for example, some of the women I talked to found it hard to see themselves as good mothers. On the flip side, though, many parents, men and women alike, had to learn how to become a different kind of parent than the one they'd imagined being, and this was sometimes really rewarding and a source of pride. Children's problems, also changed parents' orientations to work outside of the home. So several mothers and one father either reduced their work hours or they left the workforce entirely so that they could dedicate more time to parenting. At the same time, two primary earners, one a man and the other a woman, ended up feeling stuck in their jobs because children's problems meant that their families were even more dependent upon their income and health care than they had been before. But children's problems shaped parents' narratives of self in ways that were more broadly encompassing than their relationship to particular family or work-related roles. So for some parents, the troubles I've described thus far resulted in a very significant shift in how they viewed themselves and the world around them. And what I want to do here, instead of offering several quotes from different participants, I want to focus on just one participant. I think it's really only in the broader context of each parent's story that you can get a good sense of how children's problems transformed their parents' selves. So let me introduce you to Andrea. Andrea is a registered nurse in her late 50s, and she volunteered for an interview after hearing about my research at an Al-Anon meeting. If you're not familiar, Al-Anon is an offshoot of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's designed to support family members and close friends of alcoholics. The meeting I attended was comprised mostly of parents who had been troubled by their teenagers' misconduct. Andrea's daughter Lily was 19 at the time, and she had spent the better part of 2 years in an out-of-state therapeutic boarding school. There were times when Andrea thought that the program was working and that her daughter was overcoming the defiance and the aggression and the substance abuse that had caused really terrible upheaval at home. But after a series of rule violations and then an incident of drug use, Lily had gotten expelled from the program before she could graduate. When her daughter returned home, Andrea asked her to live somewhere else. By then, her daughter had turned 18, and Andrea and her husband had decided that they were going to limit her financial support. When I met Andrea, she explained that her daughter was now unemployed, living with a boyfriend, and had recently been arrested under charges of domestic violence. So Andrea was absolutely bewildered by her daughter's behavior. She herself had grown up in less than privileged circumstances. A Chinese-American child from a family of 7, she told me that her parents had done a really horrible job, but nonetheless that she and her siblings had turned out really well, had been really successful in her words. Lily, on the other hand, was an only child. Andrea saw herself as being a very attentive mother. She'd been involved in all of her daughter's grade school activities, and she and her husband had even moved to a different community so that Lily could attend a well-funded public school. Part of what was so troubling about Lily's delinquency was its unfamiliarity. Andrea marveled at her daughter's departure from what she considered to be the norm. Going to college, finding a career, not getting into trouble. That says Andrea's words. I mean, Lily's choices are so foreign to me. Having a really productive life, that's to me being happy, you know, being able to feel accomplishment and achievement and feeling proud of what you've been able to do. Doing well. I mean, somehow her motivations were not at all in line with mine, what I grew up with. Now, the most difficult years had been actually before Andrea and her husband had decided to send their daughter away for treatment. Because in Andrea's words, Lily had become hardened and uncommunicative. She often disappeared, she stayed out until wee hours of the morning, and she left Andrea to imagine where she was and what she was doing. And Andrea describes that period of her life as a period of nightmares. She said, I was like near tears the entire time, from the embarrassment, the shame, isolation, not having anybody that you could really talk to or share any of these problems with. The community made it very easy for me because they basically ignored me. I didn't have a single phone call from any other parent. When Lily didn't show up to volleyball the following year, not one parent called me to say, I understand you might be having some difficulties. Is there anything I can do? Or anytime you want to talk. Not one. It was only when I started to reach out to certain parents that the word got out, but I could not do it while I was having all the turmoil and the pain. I just couldn't. I didn't know what to say. When Lily left for treatment, Andrea and her husband sought counseling to work through some marital problems that Andrea thought had been really compounded by their daughter's delinquency. Andrea also started to attend these Al-Anon meetings where she met parents in similar situations. Employing this framework of codependency, Al-Anon encouraged Andrea to gain distance from her daughter's problems. And over time, she learned how to accept her situation. I could easily go back to that place, Andrea said, but I've learned to manage my fears better. And my husband and I have been able to repair and help sustain our relationship. I did go to the Al-Anon meetings, and you learn that there's sometimes that you have to detach. I do worry still a little bit. I try not to. I try to sort of distance myself and say, okay, I have to remind myself it's her life, it's not my life. But there's still part that hurts and hopes. Andrea unequivocally told me that coping with Lily's problems had been the most difficult thing that she has ever had to do. But at the same time, she says she feels as though the last several years have actually made her a better person. So she said, I'm grateful for the fact that I feel like I've grown a lot, and I think I'm a more sensitive person. I'm a more compassionate person. I try to live more presently. I used to be really bad about living in the future and planning things out a lot. And there's nothing like this kind of lesson that lets you know that you just can't plan some things in life. I think it's her path, it's my path, and we're both learning to live with it. And learning to live, and learning to love, and learning about life. So how do we interpret Andrea's story vis-a-vis a narrative of self? To me, these comments demonstrate how, beyond losing the child that she imagined she would have, Andrea had to let go of an overarching narrative that placed productivity and accomplishment at the center of a happy life. She herself had played by the rules, as you heard. She had worked hard to garner an education, find a meaningful vocation, and provide her daughter with a loving home. Now, in this particular storyline, which is cherished by many of us in middle-class America, Lily would follow in her mother's upward trajectory and emerge from childhood to be a really successful or happy middle-class woman. But Lily's actual trajectory, punctuated by unemployment, substance abuse, violence, and legal trouble, begins to render that story implausible. Now Andrea has learned to tell a new story about herself, a person who's become more sensitive and more compassionate. She's no longer the planner she used to be, but instead finds wisdom in living in the moment. Now this kind of shift, letting go of normalcy and becoming a more compassionate person, was something that many of the parents that I interviewed talked about. And I just want to offer two more examples before moving on to what I see as being the implications of this research. So I talked with Claire, a mother whose 9-year-old son was diagnosed with autism when he was 3. And she recounted to me an incident where the other mothers in her neighborhood were discouraging their children from befriending her son. She said that prior to his autism diagnosis, she was probably just as oblivious as these other mothers. And feeling like an outsider had transformed her, and she now views herself as a better mother and a better person. So Claire said, I wonder about myself before I got a diagnosis for my son. I mean, I see the world so differently now, and I think that people ought to encourage their children to invite the kid with a disability to their birthday party, etc. But that's just part of opening life up to their kid and for manifesting your values. But I don't know whether I was like that before, I think I've become a more compassionate person too. I see mothering now as being more about guiding your kids to be happy and empathetic, as opposed to playing the musical instrument and being a good athlete and getting them the best education, which is why we came to this town. I think my values have shifted slightly, And finally, I want to circle back to Tim, whose story we started with. And despite the devastation that he described throughout our conversation, Tim also talked at length about how his son's disabilities had made him a more compassionate person. I think I'm a deeper person. I mean, that's a real broad term, but I believe I have a better ability to relate to people who are in difficult circumstances. I think I have more sympathy for people who are down and out. And even though I had an element of that in me because of my Christian faith from the beginning, I think I've gotten more textured and layered and more nuanced in my ability to identify with people's problems and to sympathize with them, to be there for them, and to really kind of be a shoulder to lean on. I think my ability to do that, to do it with the right heart, has been improved because of my own experience. I mean, it's sort of a fellowship of the suffering, if you will, so I think that's made me a better person. Okay, so what are the broader implications of these ideas? What wisdom can be found in parents' stories and my analysis of them? And I want to be really clear at the outset that I am not a clinician or a practitioner of any kind. So Tom had shared with me some of the questions that you submitted prior to the webinar, and my sense is that some of you listening are struggling to know how to help your own children and perhaps to ameliorate a really difficult situation within your own family. Unfortunately, my work really doesn't lend itself to giving that kind of advice. But I'll share with you in any case what I've learned as both a scholar and more broadly as a human being in the course of doing this research. So the first thing that I want to focus on is the seemingly innocuous, but I think deeply problematic nature of normalcy and our ideas about normal children, normal families, normal life trajectories. And we tend to think of normal as a description of how most people are or what most people do. We tend to think of it as like a statistical average. But our ideas about what constitutes normalcy are not usually embedded in empirical realities. More often than not, especially when we're talking about normal children and normal families, we're actually talking about cultural ideals. And in this sense, the word normal has a moral significance. It doesn't just describe how things are, but indicates something about how they should be. Now, because of their children's challenges, the parents in this study really had to think and reflect on and grapple with what they had assumed was normal. But I don't think that experience is limited to the parents of children with significant problems. I think all of us at one time or another experience something in our personal lives that makes us feel as though we're undesirably different from everybody else. Something that makes us feel as though our life has gone off the rails a bit or like things aren't unfolding like we wanted them to. For some people that might be like a painful separation or a divorce. For others it might be the loss of a job or a serious illness or even the death of a close family member. Such experiences are, in and of themselves, really deeply painful and challenging. But to borrow from a bit of Buddhism here, when we're haunted by this phantom of normalcy, we shoot ourselves with a second arrow. Our suffering is compounded, in other words, by our concerns with normalcy. So I think there's a lot of utility in identifying and getting underneath and being really critical about what we take for granted as normal, not just in terms of children, but in terms of how we imagine our lives unfolding more generally. That brings me to a second thought, and that is the role of suffering in human experience. And this is where I'll conclude today. I think when we imagine our lives and what we want for ourselves and for our children, suffering doesn't play a part in our stories. If anything, we do everything we can to avoid suffering, to prevent it, to squash it. And I guess I worry when I look at the state of scholarship on human suffering about what I see as a growing intolerance for sorrow. This is not to say that we shouldn't work to reduce human suffering, not at all. And I'm concerned in particular about the suffering caused by the growing gap between rich and poor here in the United States and across the globe. But at the same time, so much research conceptualizes deep sadness as a kind of pathology, something that we should rush to cure in ourselves. And I wonder if this renders us really ill-equipped life when it's on. I guess I also wonder what would happen if we learned to see suffering as an integral part of human experience, so as something that's an inevitable companion to wonderful things like love and connection. In the case of my research, parents suffered partly because they were dogged by unhelpful notions of normalcy, but also because they loved their children so deeply. And to the extent that their suffering was linked, pretty directly to the magnitude of their love, I think there was also beauty in it. And since many of the parents I talked to actually saw themselves as having gained something or saw themselves as better people for having suffered, it makes me think that our culture more broadly and maybe social sciences more specifically need to rethink and begin to re-explore the important role of suffering in people's everyday lives. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and allow for questions. And I think what I'll do as we move into the Q&A segment is just post some additional reading for those of you who are interested. There's a lot of info on this slide. You can always take like a photograph with your smartphone instead of trying to get it all down. I've also put my email address in the bottom corner there, and you are welcome to contact me with follow-up questions or comments if that makes sense to you. I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Excellent. And as we allow Professor Francis to take a breather right now, we just want to thank her again for sharing her knowledge and her expertise with us today on a very fascinating topic, and a topic especially based on the questions that we've gotten throughout is something that a number of people can relate to, either on a personal level or on a family level. this is where we'll move over to the question and answer part. We've had a number of questions submitted already, and I encourage you throughout this piece to submit any questions that might be on your minds or something that you would like Professor Francis to address. We do have about 20 minutes remaining, so we'll jump right in. A number of participants were curious about your methodology. They were in some ways fascinated with how you identified the families that you spoke with. And I know there's some questions about the focus on the middle class. And if you could address some of that, but there seems to be a number of questions about how did you choose the families that you did, and was there a discrepancy between younger children versus older children, or did that factor in to your research at all?
Okay, so I'll start with just sort of an overview of my sort of sampling approach, and then maybe I'll move from there to talking about age discrepancy, and then maybe I can say a little bit about why this study was framed as a study of the middle class. So parents who identify their children as having problems. So I was a graduate student at the time. I was living in Northern California, and I just asked the leaders of support groups if I could show up, say a little bit about my research, and then give my information to parents who then had the option of contacting me. So I used Al-Anon, as I discussed earlier. Then I used a regional nonprofit organization that supports parents whose children have special needs. I did the local chapter of CHAD, which is Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Disorder. And then I did a fourth group also for children, parents whose children have special needs. So that's where I started, but then I also used, snowball sampling. So once I sort of got going, oftentimes parents had other recommendations for me. Eventually I found a school who served parents whose children who served children with special needs. They sent notices home in backpacks. And then oftentimes one parent would participate, and then I would recruit their spouse. So there was sort of all different angles sort of that I approached this with. As far as sampling, I will note that, I set out to interview parents who defined their children's problems as problems. And I know that that's silly and seems self-evident, but it's worth pointing out because a lot of parents, for example, whose children have mild autism may not define that as a problem, or they may not find that deeply disruptive. So when I set out to look at parents who defined their kids' problems in that way, it meant that I was more likely to yield stories that focused on disruption. So I just wanted to take note of that. Now, in terms of age, things are a little bit all over the place in the sense that some parents, had teenage children but sort of narrated for me what happened from the time their children were 2 onward, sort of like Tim and Eve. Other parents had, 4-year-olds whose children's problems had just developed. So, some were sort of, 15, 20 years in, and others still had emerging problems. And I simply sort of compared their narratives, but it was often difficult to suss out particular trajectories in terms of time. I'm wondering if I should just go ahead. What do you think, Tom? Should I go ahead and delve into this issue of middle class? I don't want to sort of just keep lecturing, but what do you think?
Maybe we get to a couple other questions.
Yeah, let's do that. And if lots of you want to hear about the choice to study middle class, we can return to that.
There's a number of questions about coping, and people are wondering if in your conversations did you find parents receiving any benefit from support, advocacy groups, peer support, and then kind of a corollary to that, and someone really commented on the husband Tim, where he mentions faith. Did any families specifically mention faith as a strong coping mechanism for them?
Let me talk about coping first, and then I'll make sure I address that question of faith at the end. So first of all, I don't really deploy the framework of coping. Now, there is sort of that psychosocial research on coping, and that's one framework you can use. Instead of coping, I, again, deploy this framework of biographical revision. So instead of looking at how parents cope, I look at how they change their stories that they tell about themselves. And that's, you know, a slightly different sort of theoretical framework. Having said that, I think talking about narratives will ultimately address your questions about coping. So a lot of parents sort of began with the coping mechanism, or what we might think of as a coping mechanism, that Arthur Franks calls the restitution narrative, which is that they put a lot of hope in medicine, and their first method of coping was to sort of throw themselves into researching and identifying the appropriate treatment for their children's problems. And they really hoped that if they could just find that magic bullet, that children's problems would sort of be ameliorated, if not cured, and that they would sort of be normalized. That did work for a few parents. But for most of the people that I interviewed, that restitution narrative became untenable. And then they moved on to what Arthur Frank calls a quest narrative. And the quest narrative is when you sort of learn to see a greater good coming out of your suffering, and they learn to see silver linings. And they learn to see themselves as better people, as I've been discussing. Now, part of how they did that was through support groups and advocacy groups, and that shouldn't be surprising given the way that I sampled, right? Most of the parents that I talked to were connected in some way to a support or an advocacy group. And the thing was that by participating in those advocacy groups, that's how parents learned how to tell new stories about themselves and their children. I think the best example of this is when parents join support groups for parents whose kids have special needs. They would often learn how to reframe their children's disabilities, or what they had previously seen as limitations, as differences, and those differences were sometimes things that you could celebrate rather than just thinking about them relative to some picture of normalcy. There's a wonderful story called Welcome to Holland, where it's all about how if you've planned, you know, a really wonderful trip to Italy, and you sort of get off the plane and you find yourself in Holland, you might really grieve the loss of the trip to Italy that you had planned. But if you can shift your attention long enough to realize what might be good about Holland, then you can sort of live in the moment in the way that Andrea was talking about. And that particular narrative, that's actually a published story by someone that gets circulated in support groups often, that really helped parents see their kids' experiences in a different way. Now, in terms of faith, Tim was actually an outlier in my study with respect to faith. I think him and maybe one other participant really focused on their Christian faith as a way that they made sense of what had happened to them. Or at least talked about how they struggled with their faith and how it was a very central part of their experience. I was actually surprised that more people did not talk about that. Now, it may have been that the area and the group of parents that I was studying, so I was in Northern California, highly educated upper middle class parents, and it just didn't come up. Now, having said that, a colleague of mine, Sue Crawford Sullivan in the Sociology and Anthropology Department, is currently studying the role of faith in parents whose children have autism. So there's good work being done about that, and I don't think at all that my group is representative of the possibilities that exist there.
Questions about, in some ways, the family dynamic, and a few people are wondering, as you spoke with these parents, did they talk at all about disruptions to siblings, whether older or younger, and how that dynamic played itself out?
Very common for parents who also had other children living at home. One of the things that I didn't talk about in this particular talk is just the severe and sometimes paralyzing amount of guilt that parents experienced. Almost every parent to a person wondered if they had either caused their child's problems or if they had done something wrong in the attempt to treat the problems in particular ways. And part of the deep guilt that they experienced was guilt around the siblings' experience in the home. So a lot of people felt like so much time and energy went to attending the child who had some kind of special challenge that their other child got short thrift, or that home life was chaotic for those other children. There were a few that talked about it as an opportunity, and again, I think that was partly sort of maybe shifting perspective and seeing what kind of opportunities there are in suffering or indifference. And they talked about how their siblings had the opportunity to see difference in a different light than other kids might ever get to experience, right? So if you have a brother or sister who's an alcoholic or a brother or sister who has autism, that shapes you deeply, but not always in negative ways. But there's no doubt about it that many of the parents I talked to felt guilty and worried tremendously about the effect on the sibling's life.
There's a few questions about kind of like a time scope. And did you, in your conversations with these families, did you find that anger or the concept of sorrow lessened over time? Especially in those examples where you were talking to families that this might have been a 15, 20-year issue for them, or did it not? There were a few questions about kind of that scope of time and if that impacted parents' reactions to some of the questions.
A couple of things about that. First of all, the way that my study was designed didn't allow me to get at that as clearly as I would have liked because everybody was at a different point in their trajectory. Now, having said that, it was certainly true that some parents, in talking about how their views had changed over time, that time did sort of lessen their sorrow, and that time did sort of heal them in a way. I think it would be tempting to want to frame parents' trajectories or what sociologists call sometimes moral careers in a stage model, and say, okay, so the height of the disruption happens at a particular time, but then they learn better how to deal or reframe, and things get easier. I guess I would resist doing that. I think, and sometimes that's absolutely true. But I also talked with parents who had been coping with children's problems for years and years and years and years, and we're still in the midst of absolute chaos. So I remember one couple had, I think, like a 12 or a 13-year-old son who they had adopted and had a brain injury that had resulted in some developmental delays and some emotional problems, and they were at their absolute wits' end and were considering institutionalization, which they did not want to do, and it was just heartbreaking. And I remember the mother looking at me and just saying, we have been dealing with this for the better part of 12 years, and it is utterly exhausting. So again, I mean, it's tempting, and I would hope and I would want to see that things would ease up over time. But there's no doubt that some of the parents that I talked to were still just doing their best to make do, and were absolutely still in the midst of chaos, even though it had been quite a while.
We have time for a couple more questions. There's been several questions about the concept of helicopter parent, and if you would be open to discussing a little bit more about what is a helicopter parent, and did that phrase come up at all in your conversations with these families? There seems to be fascination about that concept.
Does seem to be fascination with the helicopter parent. And I think that term had just sort of emerged in public discourse right around the time I was thinking about my dissertation, so it sort of informs my own interest in studying family life and having kids, and at the time I didn't have kids on my own. So if you haven't heard the term, helicopter parent is the parent who hovers, right? The parent who is always eyeing their children to make sure nothing's wrong, and who maybe is seen to be intervening too often, or who perhaps even coddles their children and does things for them that don't need doing. Now, first let me talk about how this came up in my research, and then let me talk about how I'm actually very critical of that term, and I think we should all be if we put it in historical perspective. So the first thing is that many of the parents I interviewed whose kids, young kids especially, who had behavioral problems, they felt like they had to hover, perhaps even more so than the rest of us, because they felt like if they weren't keeping a very close eye on their child might be aggressive with another kid or have problems that would further stigmatize both their kid and themselves. So I think that many times special parents of kids with special needs worry about being helicopter parents, maybe even more so than the rest of us. Now, I actually hate the term helicopter parent, because when I see it being deployed in in the New York Times and in public discourse, there's this real sense of judgment, like parents are parenting incorrectly, and if we could all just back away from our children, and if things could be like they were in the old days, it would be better. But the bottom line is, I don't think some parents are helicopter parents and others aren't. I think in historical perspective, a vast majority of us today with young kids are helicopter parents. And there are a few reasons for that. First of all, we see children as being fragile today, and that is not inherent in children themselves. We used to see children in pre-industrial times as being very sturdy, prone to sin, not innocent, and in fact, many people thought that you had to sort of break a child's will in order to prepare them for what would be a difficult life. You know, these days our children are sacred. We conceive of them as fragile, and so that leads us to treat them in a very different way than we did before. And at the same time, you have this huge proliferation of scientific and also pseudoscientific knowledge about children's health and development. So, you know, if you think maybe something's going on with your child, you type it into Google, you'll get, you know, a ton of hits, and all of them will suggest that things are dire for you, and they will cause a lot of anxiety. So that proliferation of knowledge also leads us to be really vigilant and attunes us to potential problems. The last thing I would say about that, of course, is that, you know, there's a lot at stake, right? When children are at the emotional centers of our world, the idea that something could go wrong also encourages us to hover. And I don't think this is maybe the best state of affairs by any means, but when I critique that, I don't critique parents themselves. I think we're being subject to larger historical and cultural and social forces. So I tend to try to extend compassion both to myself as the parent of young children and other parents as well, because again, I think in the larger perspective, most of us are probably hovering more than parents did in the past.
With our last question, would you like to address you know, the concept of middle class families and your focus on it, if you're okay with that?
I won't. I'll try to just sum it up. And again, if anybody wants to follow up with me, I'm completely open to correspondence via email. So there's a lot of research in the sociology of families suggesting that the ways that middle-class families, and predominantly white families like the ones that I studied, that the ways we parent are actually not representative of the broader population. So in particular, in light of our economy right now, there's a lot of status anxiety among middle-class parents and a concern that our children won't have the same kind of opportunities that we did. And so we try to cultivate them, and we deploy what one sociologist has called the orientation of concerted cultivation. It's almost as though we see our children as orchids that need the perfect conditions in order to grow and to thrive, and we offer them extracurricular opportunities and enriching opportunities, and we really want to make sure all the conditions are right. Now, all the data suggests that working class families, for example, don't engage in that kind of concerted cultivation. They have more of an attitude of natural growth, which is to say, you know, the assumption is children will be fine as long as they're loved and kept safe. Now, what this means is that if middle-class parents are really invested in terms of their time, their money, and attention in cultivating opportunities for their children, and then it turns out that children develop some kind of a special need or a special challenge or a particular problem, that there's now much more at stake. And so when I set out, I didn't want to think about problems in families writ large. I wanted to look specifically at middle-class families for whom most things had gone right, like Andrea, who had good incomes, homes of their own, high levels of education, and so on. I really wanted to know what it meant for that group of people to have a child who faced particular challenges.
We'll end there, and I just want to offer many thanks to Professor Francis for sharing her time and knowledge with us today, and we hope to continue offering these lunchtime learning alumni webinars in the future, so stay tuned for upcoming notices about future dates and times, and in the meantime, have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you for joining us.